At 2:26 in the morning, the most powerful military alliance on Earth believed it had minutes left. Not hours, not days. Minutes. Deep inside a reinforced concrete complex, buried beneath Cheyenne Mountain, warning screens began to change. Symbols multiplied, numbers updated, trajectories formed. What had been quiet routine suddenly looked like the opening moments of nuclear war. And the most disturbing part wasn't what appeared on the screens. It was that the system looked confident. In November 1979, the Cold War was already old, but it was not calm. The détente of the early 1970s had thinned. Trust between the United States and the Soviet Union was brittle. Intelligence agencies on both sides believed the other might strike first. Nuclear doctrine no longer asked if a war would happen, only how quickly leaders would recognize it. This was the environment inside NORAD. The North American Aerospace Defense Command existed for one reason only: detect an attack early enough to respond. Its radar lines stretched across the Arctic. Its satellites watched for missile launches. Its computers processed unimaginable amounts of data in real time. And its personnel were trained to treat every alert as real, until proven otherwise. That night, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Operators saw indications of a massive Soviet missile launch. Not a limited strike, not an accident, a full-scale attack. Hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles headed toward North America. This was not a drill. At least, it wasn't labeled as one. Inside the command center, routines snapped into motion. Duty officers notified superiors. Communication channels opened. Strategic Air Command began receiving data. The chain of escalation, rehearsed endlessly but never used, started to wake up. In nuclear warfare, speed matters more than certainty. Missiles launched from the Soviet Union would take roughly 30 minutes to reach their targets. That meant decision-makers had less than half an hour to determine whether the end of civilization was real or a mistake. And at this point, nothing suggested a mistake. The data streams looked clean. The simulated attack pattern matched known Soviet capabilities. There were no obvious glitches, no warning flags, no red text saying exercise. For the people in the room, this was the scenario they had trained for their entire careers, and secretly hoped would never happen. Somewhere above ground, America slept. No alarms sounded in cities. No public warning was issued. Civil defense systems were useless at this stage. If the missiles were real, there would be no time to evacuate, no shelters to reach, no instructions to follow. Everything depended on the next few minutes inside NORAD. Yet beneath the urgency, something felt wrong. Experienced officers noticed inconsistencies. Radar systems had not yet confirmed launches. Satellite data was incomplete. The scale of the attack seemed oddly symmetrical, almost too perfect. A real Soviet strike, many believed, would likely be chaotic, uneven, shaped by human error and battlefield uncertainty. This one looked orderly. That doubt mattered, because doctrine demanded retaliation if an attack was confirmed. Strategic bombers would be launched. Missile silos would prepare to fire. Once those actions began, reversing them would be nearly impossible. Human judgment was the last barrier between data and destruction. As commanders debated, technicians raced to cross-check systems. Secondary feeds were pulled. External radar confirmations were requested. Every second stretched painfully longer than the last. The computers insisted the attack was real. The humans were no longer sure. What almost no one in that room knew yet was that the danger did not come from Moscow. It came from inside the system itself. From a failure no one had anticipated. hidden in the very technology designed to prevent surprise. By the time clarity began to emerge, the margin for error had narrowed to a razor's edge. If a single decision had gone the other way, if hesitation had turned into assumption, if trust in machines had overridden doubt, history would remember November 1979 very differently. But the question remains: how did the world come this close without anyone outside that mountain ever knowing? And more unsettling still, how many times since then has the same line been tested without us realizing it? Inside Cheyenne Mountain, time no longer moved normally. Clocks still ticked, lights still hummed. But for the men and women in the command center, the world had narrowed to screens, voices, and rapidly shrinking options. Every second that passed without confirmation was not a relief. It was a threat. In nuclear defense, uncertainty is often more dangerous than bad news. The alert that night did not arrive with drama. No sirens, no shouting, just data, cold, precise, and relentless. The main display showed what appeared to be a coordinated Soviet missile launch, originating from multiple known ICBM fields. Trajectories arced across digital maps, converging on targets that had been studied for decades. Missile silos, command centers, major cities. This was the nightmare scenario. Under NORAD protocol, the first step was verification. No single system was ever supposed to trigger a response on its own. Early warning satellites, ground-based radars, and computer modeling were meant to agree before escalation moved forward. But here was the problem. The primary warning system was screaming certainty. The computers responsible for processing attack data had already categorized the event as a real strike. Confidence levels were high. Probability estimates climbed. On paper, this looked indistinguishable from the opening minutes of World War III. Senior officers were alerted almost immediately. Phones rang in offices where people had been half asleep minutes earlier. Strategic Air Command began receiving preliminary notifications. Elsewhere, launch crews, unaware of the full picture, were quietly being brought to readiness. None of this required political authorization yet, but it was moving in that direction. At this stage, no one wanted to be the person who delayed a response to a real attack. Cold War history was filled with warnings about hesitation, about false hope, about leaders who waited too long and paid the price. Yet experience cut both ways. Veteran commanders knew that real-world launches rarely behaved exactly as predicted. Human error, technical limitations, and chaotic execution usually left fingerprints in the data. Something about this attack pattern felt too clean, too evenly spaced, too mathematically perfect. One officer reportedly asked a simple question that cut through the tension. Where are the radar confirmations? Ground-based radar stations along the northern perimeter should have begun detecting incoming warheads by now. The Soviet Union could not launch hundreds of missiles without lighting up the Arctic sky. Yet the radars remained silent. This contradiction created a dangerous standoff between systems. The computers insisted the missiles were real. The radars suggested they were not. That gap forced a pause, not because protocol demanded it, but because human judgment intervened. Orders to escalate were slowed. Cross-checks were intensified. Engineers were pulled in to examine the data flow itself, not just the conclusions. That decision mattered more than anyone realized at the time. As technicians dug deeper, they traced the alert back through NORAD's internal network. What they found was not a malfunctioning sensor or a hardware failure. The problem lay in the software, specifically in a training scenario that had somehow leaked into the live operational system. Earlier that day, a simulation tape had been loaded to test response readiness. It contained a realistic mock Soviet attack, designed to stress the system and the people operating it. The exercise was supposed to remain isolated. It did not. Somehow, the simulated data was fed into the real-time warning stream. The computers did not know the difference. They were never designed to. To a machine, simulated missile trajectories and real missile trajectories are identical if the input matches expected parameters. And this simulation had been built to be convincing. Too convincing. What saved the world that night was not advanced technology, but skepticism. Human beings noticed the inconsistencies. Human beings questioned the timing. Human beings hesitated when machines showed confidence. And that hesitation created just enough space for the truth to surface. Once the source of the alert was identified, the false attack was terminated. Notifications were cancelled. Escalation halted. Strategic forces were quietly stood down. By morning, the public knew nothing. No emergency broadcast, no headlines, no speeches. Officially, it was logged as a training error. Internally, it was something else entirely. Proof that the system designed to prevent surprise attack could itself become the trigger. And if a simple training tape could nearly initiate nuclear war in 1979, what did that mean for the future? As systems became faster, more automated, and more trusted than the people watching them, because the most unsettling realization was still ahead. This wasn't the first time it had happened, and it would not be the last. So how many times has humanity survived, not because the system worked, but because someone chose to doubt it at exactly the right moment? The more accurate the warning system became, the more dangerous it was. By 1979, NORAD's greatest strength was also its greatest risk. The system had been engineered to remove hesitation, to eliminate doubt, to deliver clear answers faster than any human ever could. And in doing so, it quietly trained its operators to trust the machine more than themselves. That night inside Cheyenne Mountain exposed how thin that line really was. After the false alert was identified and shut down, the command center did not celebrate. There was no relief-filled laughter, no sense of victory. Instead, there was silence, the kind that follows when people realize they were closer to disaster than they are comfortable admitting. Within hours, internal reviews began. Senior officers demanded to know how a training simulation had crossed into live operational systems. Engineers traced signal pathways, reviewed access protocols, and examined assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. What emerged was not a single mistake, but a pattern of quiet overconfidence. The system worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. NORAD's computers were never built to understand intent. They did not know what a drill was. They did not recognize context. They simply processed inputs and produced conclusions. If the data looked real, it was treated as real. And the 1979 simulation had been designed to look indistinguishable from an actual Soviet launch, because realism was considered essential for training. No one had seriously considered what would happen if realism escaped its container. In the aftermath, officials reassured themselves that safeguards existed, multiple confirmation layers, human oversight, redundant checks. And it was true. Those layers had prevented catastrophe this time. But the incident revealed something deeper. The system depended not on certainty, but on hesitation. It depended on people being willing to slow things down when everything around them screamed urgency. That was never written into any manual. It was an unwritten human instinct, and one that could not be guaranteed under pressure. Cold War planners understood the implications immediately. If the false alert had occurred during a moment of heightened geopolitical tension, a crisis, an exercise, or an intelligence standoff, the outcome might have been different. Leaders primed for conflict interpret ambiguity as confirmation. Systems under stress amplify assumptions. And 1979 was already moving in that direction. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was weeks away. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were increasing readiness. Military exercises were growing larger and more aggressive. Trust was collapsing. In that climate, even a minor delay or miscommunication could become fatal. What troubled analysts most was how little time existed for reflection. From first alert to potential retaliation, decision-makers had minutes. Not enough to investigate deeply, not enough to consult widely, just enough to act, or fail to. And once retaliation began, it could not be undone. This was the logic of deterrence. Respond quickly enough to ensure survival, even if that meant acting on incomplete information. The system assumed rational actors and reliable machines. But the 1979 incident proved that machines could be confidently wrong, and that rationality under extreme pressure was fragile. Quietly, changes were proposed. Training simulations were more tightly isolated. Software access controls were reviewed. Verification procedures were refined. But none of these addressed the core issue. Increasing automation meant shrinking human involvement at the most critical moments. Every improvement in speed reduced the margin for doubt. And doubt, it turned out, was the only thing standing between data and annihilation. Years later, some officers involved would admit something unsettling. During those minutes of uncertainty, there was no clear sense of control. The system felt like it was pulling events forward faster than anyone could comfortably manage. Decisions were reactive, not deliberate. That feeling never fully went away, because once you realize how close you came, you begin to see the warning signs everywhere. A glitch here, a misread signal there, a system behaving exactly as expected, for the wrong reason. The 1979 incident did not end the danger. It revealed it, and it raised a question that no amount of technology could answer. If the next warning looked just as convincing, if the computers showed even higher confidence, and if the political climate was even more hostile, would doubt survive long enough to matter? Because the most dangerous weapon of the Cold War was not the missile. It was the belief that the system would always know the difference between practice and reality. And in the years that followed, that belief would be tested again, under even worse conditions. Every lesson learned from 1979 made the system faster, not wiser. After the NORAD false alert, confidence publicly returned. Internally, however, a quiet fear settled in. Not fear of Soviet missiles, but fear of the machinery meant to detect them. Because the solution to almost every identified weakness followed the same logic. Automate more, integrate faster, reduce human delay. The assumption was simple and dangerous. Humans hesitate. Machines do not. Therefore, machines must lead. Throughout the early 1980s, early warning systems grew more complex and more interconnected. Satellite detection improved. Data fusion became faster. Decision timelines were shortened in the name of survivability. The window between detection and response shrank year by year. On paper, this made sense. In reality, it amplified risk. Military planners began to rely less on cross-confirmation and more on probability modeling. Instead of asking, "Is this real?" Systems increasingly asked, how likely is it that this is real? That subtle shift mattered. Probability does not require certainty, only confidence. And confidence can be manufactured. Inside command structures, the human role quietly changed. Officers were no longer expected to challenge the data, only to interpret it quickly. The culture rewarded decisiveness, not skepticism. Doubt became something to overcome, not something to protect. This shift was invisible to the public, but deeply felt inside defense institutions. Some commanders worried privately that the safeguards praised after 1979 were fragile. They depended on people noticing something felt wrong, a subjective instinct with no formal authority. There was no rule book for hesitation, no protocol for doubt. And under real crisis conditions, instincts are the first things suppressed. Exercises reflected this mindset. Simulations became more aggressive. Scenarios assumed surprise attacks, compressed timelines, incomplete information. The goal was to condition decision-makers to act under pressure. But the side effect was desensitization. False warnings stopped feeling hypothetical. They started feeling inevitable. By 1983, tensions between NATO and the Soviet Union reached one of their most volatile peaks since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Rhetoric hardened. Military movements intensified. Each side believed the other might be preparing for a first strike disguised as an exercise. This context mattered more than technology, because early warning systems do not exist in isolation. They operate inside political narratives. When leaders expect hostility, they interpret ambiguity as threat. The same alert that would be dismissed during calm relations becomes terrifying during confrontation. And this time, the system would not just simulate an attack, it would misinterpret reality itself. The memory of 1979 lingered quietly in the background, not as a warning, but as reassurance. After all, disaster had been avoided. The safeguards had worked. People had intervened. But that reassurance rested on a dangerous assumption, that there would always be time to intervene. That assumption was about to be tested by a system far less forgiving than NORAD's training tape. In late September 1983, thousands of miles away, a Soviet officer sat inside a bunker watching a screen very similar to the one at Cheyenne Mountain. Different language, different doctrine, same logic. The system in front of him was newer, faster, and far more confident. It told him that American missiles were in the air. Unlike 1979, there was no exercise tape, no accidental simulation. The data came from space, from satellites designed to eliminate ambiguity. According to Soviet doctrine, this was the most reliable warning possible. And unlike the United States, the Soviet system placed far less emphasis on human override. That officer had minutes to decide whether to trust the machine. What he chose to do would never be celebrated publicly. It would not be revealed for years, and it would prove something deeply unsettling about nuclear safety. That survival was not guaranteed by systems, treaties, or strategy. It was guaranteed by a single human being choosing to doubt what looked like certainty. The world would come closer to nuclear war in 1983 than it ever had in 1979. And when it did, there would be no training tape to blame. Only a question that still haunts early warning doctrine today. When the system is absolutely sure, and time is almost gone, who is brave enough to say it might be wrong? The paradox deepened in 1983. The safer the system claimed to be, the more dangerous human judgment became. On September 26, 1983, in a Soviet early warning bunker known as Serpukhov 15, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov began his shift like any other. His role was narrow, but catastrophic in implication. He was not there to decide policy. He was there to interpret the output of a machine and pass it up the chain. Shortly after midnight, alarms activated. The screen in front of Petrov indicated that a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from American territory. Then another, then another, then two more. 5 missiles in total. According to the system, this was not ambiguous. Confidence levels were high. The satellites had detected heat plumes consistent with launches. The computer classified the alert as reliable. Soviet protocol was clear. Petrov was required to report the alert as a real attack. From there, the information would move upward, to commanders, then to political leadership, under intense time pressure. Retaliation doctrine assumed that confirmation meant response. Waiting could mean annihilation. But something didn't make sense. If the United States were launching a first strike, it would not send 5 missiles. It would send hundreds. A limited launch contradicted everything Soviet planners believed about American strategy. A first strike would aim to decapitate leadership and disable retaliation, not provoke it with a symbolic gesture. The system said the attack was real. Petrov's instincts said it was not. This was not hesitation born of fear. It was doubt born of context. He understood the technology, he understood the doctrine, and he understood that machines could misinterpret reality when forced into binary choices. Petrov reported the alert as a false alarm. He did so without confirmation from radar, without permission, and against standing procedure. He relied entirely on judgment, knowing that if he was wrong, the consequences would be irreversible. Minutes passed. No missiles arrived. The system had failed. Sunlight reflecting off cloud formations had fooled the satellites. The computer had done exactly what it was designed to do, and nearly triggered nuclear war as a result. Petrov was not rewarded. His action violated protocol. His decision created an uncomfortable truth. The system had been wrong, and a human had overridden it. That reality did not fit neatly into military doctrine built on automation and certainty. The incident was classified. Petrov's career quietly stalled. The world remained unaware. From an institutional perspective, the lesson was not that humans should be trusted more. It was that systems needed refinement. Algorithms were adjusted. Sensors recalibrated. Redundancy increased. But the core contradiction remained. The more layers added to prevent error, the more operators were trained to defer to the machine. Skepticism was tolerated only when it aligned with system logic. Intuition remained unofficial, and therefore risky. The 1979 NORAD incident and the 1983 Soviet false alarm were separated by ideology, geography, and doctrine. Yet they shared a single thread. Survival depended on doubt, not technological superiority, not treaties, not deterrence theory, doubt, and doubt does not scale well. As the Cold War progressed, warning systems grew faster still. Decision windows narrowed, automation increased. Humans became supervisors of processes they could no longer fully audit in real time. By the end of the decade, both superpowers relied on machines to tell them when the world was ending, and expected humans to respond instantly. The paradox hardened into policy. Peace depended not on certainty, but on restraint. Security depended not on speed, but on hesitation. Yet everything about the system pushed in the opposite direction. Today, those Cold War systems are often described as primitive, slow, crude by modern standards. But they carried something modern systems increasingly lack: room for uncertainty, room for someone to pause, room to ask whether confidence is the same thing as truth. because if the past proved anything, it was this. The most dangerous moment is not when alarms fail. It is when alarms work perfectly, and everyone believes them. And that raises a final, unsettling question, one that no update or upgrade can fully answer. In a world where systems decide faster than humans can think, who decides when thinking is still allowed? Nuclear peace survived not because the IU system was reliable, but because it was fragile. By the late 1980s, both superpowers quietly understood what they could never admit publicly. Early warning systems were not shields. They were accelerants. They did not prevent catastrophe. They compressed it into smaller and smaller windows, where a single decision could end everything. And those windows were closing. Technology advanced faster than doctrine. Computers became quicker at recognizing patterns, but no better at understanding meaning. Human operators were given less time to reflect and more pressure to comply. The idea of launch on warning, responding before confirmation of impact, was debated, refined, and dangerously normalized. The logic was ruthless. If you wait to be sure, you may not survive to respond. That logic still governs nuclear strategy today. The NORAD incident of 1979 and the Soviet false alarm of 1983 were not anomalies. They were previews. They revealed how modern warfare had shifted from battlefields to data streams, from soldiers to sensors, from judgment to probability. And probability does not care about consequences. What ultimately prevented disaster in both cases was not protocol. It was human friction. People slowed things down. People questioned outputs. People hesitated when the system expected obedience. That hesitation was never guaranteed. It depended on experience, on personality, on someone being willing to risk their career, or worse, to say, "This doesn't feel right." There is no algorithm for that. After the Cold War ended, many assumed the danger ended with it. Missiles were decommissioned, tensions eased, headlines moved on. But the architecture of early warning did not disappear. It evolved. Today's systems are faster, more integrated, and far more automated. Artificial intelligence assists threat detection. Machine learning models filter noise from signal. Decision support tools rank probabilities and recommend actions. The time to think is shorter than ever, and the uncomfortable truth is this: modern systems are better at being convincing than Cold War systems ever were. They rarely fail loudly. They fail quietly, with confidence. The world has not come close to nuclear war once. It has come close repeatedly, and often without knowing it. Each time, survival depended on a human moment of doubt inside a machine-driven process. A pause, a question, a refusal to treat data as destiny. That is not a strategy, it is a gamble. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange, not because deterrence was perfect, but because imperfection interrupted it at critical moments, because systems were incomplete, because humans were still allowed, sometimes accidentally, to think. That margin is shrinking. When future warning systems trigger, they will do so with more data, higher confidence, and less ambiguity than ever before. They will not ask for permission. They will expect response. And, when that moment comes, the same question will return, unchanged since 1979. Is this real, or is it only convincing? The answer may again depend on a single person, somewhere underground, staring at a screen, deciding whether to trust a system that has never been wrong before. Because the most dangerous illusion in nuclear history is not aggression, it is certainty. And as long as civilization relies on machines to tell it when the world is ending, The true safeguard will never be technology. It will be doubt, fragile, human, and terrifyingly rare. The night NORAD detected a fake nuclear attack did not end in disaster, but it did leave behind a warning that still echoes through every early warning system on Earth. The end of the world does not begin with explosions. It begins with a screen that looks absolutely sure, and a human being who must decide whether to believe it. No cities burned, no missiles flew, no history books mark the date in bold, and yet, on that night, the machinery of war did exactly what it was built to do. It detected, it calculated, it prepared. What stopped it was not a safeguard written into code, but a moment of human restraint, a pause where certainty was questioned and procedure gave way to judgment. That is why this story belongs here. Because the most dangerous wars are not the ones we fight. They are the ones we almost begin, quietly, confidently, and by mistake. This was not a victory. It was a narrow escape. And it reminds us of something unsettling. As long as machines decide when war has started, peace will depend on people brave enough to say, "Not yet." This was the war that never was.